I wanted to understand how, at the end of the war, the American troops actually reached Berlin and how that movement happened, since it was very strange that the Russian army allowed it, letting the Americans through, even putting American forces in the best areas of Berlin, like Tempelhof Airport there, Tempelhof. Considering that everything around the state of Brandenburg was already taken by the Red Army. Was that stupidity on the part of the Russians? Look, Paulo, it wasn't stupidity on the part of the Russians, because that had already been agreed upon, man. That was already part of a big agreement. What agreement was that? That was the agreement to divide Europe into zones of influence and zones of occupation after the war between the three major allies, right? Which ended up involving France as well. And this agreement was established at the Yalta Conference. This famous photo here, which I'm sure you've already seen, was taken there in Crimea, the famous Crimea, right, which today is the focus of attention in the war in Ukraine. Down in the south of Crimea, way down south at the southern tip, there's a city called Yalta. It's a kind of coastal resort. And it was there that this last meeting of the three great leaders took place, right? Yeah, just as the three great leaders were set up during most of the war. What I mean by that is Franklin Roosevelt, who's there in the middle, right? Visibly thinner, visibly more fragile, older, right? Because Roosevelt, from 1944 to 45, man, in 1945, he really took a hit in the second half of 1944. I believe it was the elections, okay? The 1944 campaign that drained his energy. So Roosevelt wasn't in very good health already, and that made him decline a lot, right? So at the Yalta Conference, he was in pretty bad health. Churchill was there, but he didn't have much say, right? In fact, it was here in Yalta that Churchill simply had to understand and put up with, and swallow the reality that Stalin was going to keep Poland, right? The reason why England went to war in 1939, right? Poland was simply handed over to Soviet control, and Churchill was powerless to stop it. And what was the most important thing agreed upon at this meeting? It was agreed that Western Europe would be an area of American and British influence. That is the Netherlands, Belgium, Luxembourg, Italy, Spain, Portugal, all these countries would be in the Western sphere of influence, right? Including Greece, okay? Churchill managed to keep Greece within his desired sphere of influence. Yeah, but the rest of Eastern Europe, everything surrounding Greece, like Bulgaria, Romania, Hungary, Poland, Baltic, Moldova, the three Baltic countries, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. All of that fell under the Soviet sphere of influence. And then the issue of German territory comes up. What are we going to do with Germany's territory, right? France, as I told you, is not represented here, right? Charles de Gaulle was not represented here. You don't see any major French delegate there. However, the partition of German territory did take France into consideration. Because France, is a historic hegemonic European power and has always been. And the setback they suffered in 1940 shouldn't, in the end, diminish that importance. Especially Churchill made a point of keeping the French, within the first tier, the top group, the group of beneficiaries of the occupation after the war, as well as the Americans, who have that close relationship with the French that goes back to the American War of Independence, in which the French sent troops to support the Americans. Okay? So because of that, the French, who were left out of most of the war, were also given a seat at the negotiating table and took a piece of Germany, right? Imagine what would be the most logical line of reasoning for Churchill and Roosevelt. Damn, if you divide Germany into four, each of our slices here will be bigger than if we divide Germany into three, right? So, if we divide Germany into three, the Soviet slice will be bigger. But if we divide Germany into four, the Soviet slice will be smaller. So we'll get a bigger piece of Germany for ourselves, right? So that was the line of reasoning that was followed at Yalta. And therefore, the fighting in the following months, February, March, April, and the beginning of May, was shaped with this concern in mind. In other words, the British and American allied armies should only advance up to a certain position, because beyond that point, it's Soviet territory. Okay? And then, from Yalta on, it's also decided that there won't be any advance on Berlin by the Americans, because the whole area of Brandenburg, is the Soviet occupation zone. So it really wouldn't make sense for the Americans to to fight for Berlin. But you'll see, okay? You'll see that the city of Berlin itself, not the province, but the city itself, was also divided among the four major powers: the Soviet Union, the United States, England, and France. So we'll understand soon why you're saying that the Soviets might have made a mistake, right? And they handed over the best areas of Berlin to the Americans. But look at how Europe looked at the moment of the German surrender. This here is the Soviet front line, right? All the territory occupied by the Soviets is shown here in purple. You can see it there in purple. So Poland was an active participant in the war, right? But it was occupied by the Soviets. That's why it's striped here. And we'll see that the pink area, do you see this pink area here? It's the British area, the British occupation area. The British occupied Norway at the end of the war, Denmark too, and the entire eastern part of Italy, right? And the Americans occupied this central and southern part of Germany, of Austria, and also the western part of Italy, as you can see here. But interestingly, look, I told you that there was right here a demarcation zone in Eastern Europe, right, designated as a Soviet area. Notice that Czechoslovakia is occupied by the United States. At least its westernmost part is occupied by the United States. This was the work of George Patton's Third Army. George Patton advanced beyond the line determined by Eisenhower, which was the border of the Czech Republic here, look, of Czechoslovakia at the time. He advanced into Czechoslovakia, captured Pilsen, and wanted to march on Prague when he was forbidden by Eisenhower to march on Prague. And then after that, the Americans had to pull back here, look, pull back to the occupation demarcation line at the end of the war, okay? The same thing happened with territories here, look, in the heart of Germany. These territories also had to be vacated here so they could be occupied by the Germans. Sorry, occupied by the Soviets. I said Germans, occupied by the Soviets, okay? So guys, in the end, how did the occupation of Germany turn out? Take a look. This is the new territory of Germany, right? The eastern territories here were separated and given to Poland as compensation for the loss of the eastern Polish territories that were given to Belarus. So, at the end of the war, we have a reconfiguration of Polish territory further to the west, and also of German territory, which loses all of its eastern territories, okay? So, German territory shrinks, and Polish territory is kind of shifted. To the west, so it doesn't lose territory, so it doesn't lose area, okay? Anyway, here we have the new Germany partition between the British zone, a French zone here on the French coast, an American zone in Bavaria here, together with Austria right, which had a good part of northern Austria here occupied by the Americans. And here, the Soviet area, right, the Soviet area along the border with Czechoslovakia, right? It's not shown on this map, but the port of Bremen, which is right here, was also an American occupation area because the Americans, as you can see, didn't have any coastline, right? Their occupation area in Europe doesn't have any coastline. So for them to bring supplies from the United States and unload them, they need a port. So they got a port here inside the British area where they could bring the supplies down here, right? And here, look, Berlin. Look there, the little city of Berlin over there. How was Berlin divided, man? Berlin was divided here. As you can see, the Soviet area, right? Since the Soviet Union was going to capture Berlin. As had already been decided back at the Yalta conference, the Soviet area of Berlin was the largest. Look at that. It was the largest. And then up here in the north, we had a French occupation area. And here in the center, an occupation area by the British. And in the south, an area occupied by the Americans. I don't know if Tempelhof is going to be in the British area or in the American area, okay? It could be in the American area, like you said. Soviet. What's going to happen in the early 50s, man? In the early 50s, the French and the British will hand over responsibility for their occupation zones to the Americans. So from then on, we have that setup of West Germany and East Germany, right? Occupied by the United States and the Soviet Union, respectively. And particularly, West Berlin is occupied by the Americans. And we'll have an area, right, that's significantly larger than East Berlin, right? In the end, adding up the three occupation zones. So what happens in 1945, right? In 1945, the Soviets and the Americans, starting from April 21st, they will attack Berlin directly, right? They will begin surrounding the city. On the 24th, they managed to close the siege of the city. On April 30th, then, Hitler will commit suicide. And on the night of April 30th, from the early hours of April 30th to May 1st, the Reichstag, the German parliament building, will be captured by the Soviets. And on the 2nd, the Soviets will enter Hitler's bunker, and they'll find everything empty there, right? And the Germans themselves, the commanders, will enter Berlin, they'll enter the Berlin bunker, and in Berlin. General Helmut Weidling will surrender to General Vasily Trikov, commander of the Soviet 8th Shock Army, thus concluding the Battle of Berlin. Let's go then. From May 2nd, 1945, we still have another week of fighting until the surrender on May 8th, which is signed here, look, in Karlshorst in East Berlin. Okay, so once the final surrender of Germany is signed on May 8th, right, May 9th for the Russians, because due to the time zone, it was already May 9th there in Moscow. The Soviet Union will establish and fortify its area of occupation here, all along its border here. In May, the Americans will withdraw from Czechoslovakia and also from these areas here, look, in the south of East Germany that they were occupying. So the Americans will withdraw to their demarcation lines. The British will complete the occupation of northern Germany, which they hadn't finished yet, as well as Denmark and Norway. And only in the month of June will they start to think about taking over their occupation zones in East Berlin. But sorry, I mean in Berlin, inside East Germany. But the Soviets won't agree at first. Look, they won't make it easy for the transfer of troops, for the entry of American and British troops into Berlin, okay? In fact, the American spearhead of this occupation, which was the 2nd Armored Division, right? The Hell Berlin. Hell on wheels, hell on wheels. She will have to do it. She will have to make a detour, man. A 140-kilometer detour to be able to enter Berlin. I think it's from the south, actually, because the Soviets had barred use of the nearest bridge here. So, actually, only at the beginning of July 1945, only on July 3rd was this border opened. Why? Because then the American command wants to celebrate Independence Day in Berlin. And what does Stalin do? Stalin agrees. I can't hold it back anymore, right? It's an agreement. So Stalin allows it. And then on July 4th, 1945, the important date, July 4th, American Independence Day, the British, the Americans, and the French enter Berlin for the first time. Okay? By then, the city had already been under Soviet occupation for more than 2 months, exclusively Soviet occupation of the city. And it's only from that point on that the Western Allies will take up their occupation posts in the western area of Berlin. And then the Soviets start to leave their occupation areas in the west of Berlin. Do you understand? So that was more or less the timeline for you to understand when the first Western troops arrived in Berlin, right? And it's right at the height of summer that we see those really beautiful color videos, right? Of occupied Berlin right after the victory. So the city was completely destroyed, of course, but we see the first color footage made by the Americans and the British right around that time, okay? I've even already made a video here about the victory parade that the British held in their occupation zone just a few days after they arrived there in Berlin, right? So if you want to know the details about all of that, just watch this video, okay? Victory Parade, Berlin, 1945. If you're interested in understanding a little more, so actually that's it, man. There was no stupidity on the part of the Soviet Army, the Red Army, or Stalin. Actually, this had already been agreed upon even before the Germans surrendered. Did you like that answer? Do you want to continue learning about military history from World War II? Look, I have this option for you here, which is Atomo como Arma, my book about the development and use of atomic bombs in World War II. Here you will learn everything about how this weapon was developed and the importance of its use to end the conflict. It's for sale at WeClap. Use the link in the description or the on-screen QR code. And if you want this book here autographed, a signed copy for you, just send an email to saladaguerre@gmail.com with your zip code so I can calculate the shipping.